Welcome to the show today. I'm joined by Jude Blanchette. Jude is the Distinguished Tang Chair in China Research and the inaugural director of the RAND China Research Center. Jude, it's great to have you on.
It's really great to be here, Seth.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk to Jude about the Xi Jinping Donald Trump meeting and all of the implications around such issues as Taiwan is that Jude lived for about a decade in China and also occasionally visits. So there's a little bit of that on the ground feel that I think most people that study or work on China just don't have. So Jude, I really appreciate you giving us kind of a sense, also based on your travel to and from China. So let's start off with the discussion. There was a lot of bluster on both sides about who won, who got the better results of the negotiation. What's your 10 cents? Who won?
I try to avoid putting these in binaries of wins and losses because I think both sides in some sense got a little of what they wanted and didn't get as much as what they wanted. I think if we're accurately looking at this, though, first of all, we've really done with this agreement is get us to where we were a few months ago. Neither side has moved the ball forward substantially.
And by a few months ago, we're back to where, like January?
Summer. No, I
Summer.
think this summer.
Okay.
I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I have to foreshadow this now because I think that is the biggest piece where the United States has seen a setback is, as a part of the agreement last week, China left in place all of the export control regime that it announced earlier in the summer and then again in October, but just promising essentially to give a general license for companies. But they still left all the architecture there, and I think we'll talk about this later. We'll be dealing with that for a while. That story hasn't gone away, and the Trump administration was unable to.
And I do want to talk about the export licensing system that the Chinese have because it seems to be quite opaque. But we will get to that, as you're right.
So the deal in some ways was very minimal. If you remember in the summer, there was talk about a Trump-Xi meeting yielding some sort of grand bargain. Taiwan was going to be in there. We were going to see substantial, potential rollbacks of U.S. export controls. There was going to be some new normative framing of the relationship that the Chinese were going to push for, et cetera, et cetera. And what we got was the U.S. agreed to knock back 10% of its tariff rate in return for China, according to the White House reading of this, that China was going to take aggressive actions to curb the flow of fentanyl precursor chemicals into North America. The United States agreed to pause a recent Commerce Department rule that put anywhere between 10 to 20,000 Chinese companies on the entity list, what's called the 50% rule. The United States agreed to pause that. And then, as we just mentioned, the Chinese said, we're not going to get rid of the export control regime that we announced in October, but we'll give a general license for the U.S. Left out of this potentially is the Europeans, who are still trying to figure out if they're able to follow in the wake of the United States. But beyond that, really not a lot was agreed, and I think now many eyes are looking at a possible Trump-Xi meeting in Beijing in April of next year to see if any of these larger propositions are on the table.
So one of the items that I wanted to get to, because it does have some defense implications, Jude, is that it looks like Beijing promised to ease some of the controls that it imposed on the exports of processed rare earth minerals for a year. There have been some administration officials saying it might be longer. There are some who've read this saying actually it's not necessarily a year. It's just until China decides that it's okay with the current system. So could you explain, though, what is the significance of the rare earth minerals? I mean, for those on the defense sector, they're certainly used for smartphones, which everyone's going to understand, but also submarines, fighter jets. So what is the importance of the minerals, and how did this even happen in the first place?
Yeah, to get to the bottom line up front, I think this is arguably one of the biggest, most significant shifts in technology, landscape, supply chains, and critical minerals that we've seen in a generation. The story is a slow moving, what Xi Jinping would call a gray rhino. This is a risk that we all saw coming from a long time, although it just picked up speed in the summer. But China has carved out for itself a nice near monopoly position in the processing of a lot of these rare earths and critical minerals, magnets. And part of that is, the U.S. And other countries, but especially the United States, got out of the business of this a long time ago because we were worried about some of the environmental costs. And honestly, we weren't thinking about moments like this where a rival would have a key choke point. China was happy to deal with some of the environmental externalities in as a trade for basically having this commanding heights position where they can control the real upstream of global production. Gallium, germanium, some of these critical magnets. Starting 5 or 6 years ago, Beijing really picked up the intensity of its effort to create a toolkit that would allow it to navigate geopolitical competition with more acuity and a bit more punitive force. Part of that was in reaction to U.S. policies. Partly that was China just trying to gain control over the upstream. But fast forward to this earlier this summer, when in response to the Liberation Day tariffs, Beijing put out an initial export control regime that tightened some existing controls they had in place. But it was a real shock to corporate America and corporate Europe, which suddenly found that they were having trouble getting licenses from the Chinese for, these tiny little magnets that we don't think about, but are critical to a whole range of commercial and defense technology: wind turbines, EV motors, jet engines, radar defense systems. That was the subject of a back and forth between the United States in the summer, where everyone was thinking about a trade war, but as much what was happening was a choke point war, where the Chinese were leveraging this choke point they had to basically put a finger on a carotid artery of the U.S. economy to get the Trump administration to back down from some of its tariffs. We then put in place our own choke points on China's ability to purchase jet engines, tires, spare parts. That was negotiated away. But then in October, the Chinese, in what they say was a response to a Commerce Department action, went wholly out of proportion and basically brought a bazooka to a knife fight and announced.
I was going to say this was like a nuclear option.
100%, which some Chinese scholars now call it the nuclear option, whereas Beijing immediately was saying, well, this is a proportionate reaction to what you started, but it was not. It was wholly disproportionate, and it was not just targeting the United States. It basically said to the entire global economy, if you are getting anything that has 0.1% or more value of rare earths that are produced or processed in China, you need to get a license. So it wasn't just exporting rare earths from China, it was this extraterritoriality measure of it, which was sweeping in nature.
And so, Jude, one question on where companies actually had to get the license from. What ministry within China does this power sit, and how much transparency goes into any American company trying to understand how they make their decisions?
Yep. Ministry of Commerce, or MOFCOM, is the entity which controls these licenses. So what would happen is Seth Jones Company, which makes very fine American products.
Very fine American
Very
products.
fine. They last forever. I'm wearing them right now. Will apply for a license in China, and that will go up probably through a locality. So it might be in Shenzhen, it might be in Shanghai. A municipal MOFCOM will give a first look. It'll then get kicked up to Beijing, where it'll be processed. Now, we could spend an hour on this, and I'll try to sort of contract the details here. But what happened in the summer is a whole bunch of things which you could ordinarily just export as a Chinese exporter of some of these magnets or rare earths. Suddenly now, you needed a license approval to export that to Seth Jones Corporation. Two things happened at the same time. One, Beijing was using this new licensing regime as hostage taking, right? It's a great way to apply targeted political pressure on the United States. You can target specific firms by basically delaying, dragging, or denying a license. But the second problem is China got way over its skis here, and it surged through a new export control restriction, which placed massive new bureaucratic pressure on Ministry of Commerce without MOFCOM having built up the requisite team to process these licenses. So in the summer when I was in Beijing, I was meeting with American companies, and they were saying, we don't know where our license stands. we're running out of stockpiles for these, and we're going to have to start making some very difficult production decisions if we don't get a free flow of some of these magnets in particular. We're essentially, to what you said earlier, this new agreement between the U.S. and China doesn't solve that issue. The loaded gun is on the table. Beijing has said we're going to grant a general license, but anytime that Beijing is upset, misunderstands, finds frustrating something we do in a totally different domain, this can immediately come back onto the fore. And Secretary Bessent gave an interview yesterday where he essentially said as much. The administration knows this, that this is not a permanent solution, that the Chinese at any point could renege on their side of the deal, and we're back to square one. We can talk about this later or now, but that's why you're starting to see finally some real momentum on we can't live under the yoke of this Chinese threat forever. And so we've, again, to the Gray Rhino point, we should have seen this earlier. Many did. Many have been calling for us to de-risk on this. You're seeing momentum now. You saw the agreement between the Australians and the U.S. when Prime Minister Albanese was in Washington a couple of weeks ago. In the private sector, there's, a ton of venture capital going into some of these firms that are doing more on recycling technology, substituting out some of the rare earths we need from China and finding synthetic alternatives. This is going to be an everything approach where it's going to be mining more, cutting red tape so that way we can process around some of the environmental restrictions. It's going to be technology. But, and I'll end on this, even if we have a Manhattan project on this, we're still going to be dealing with the Chinese choke point for the next few years until we can get enough, supply that we can start extricating ourselves from this chokehold.
Yeah, just to put a fine point on this before going to Taiwan, this does not just affect trade, basic economic trade. This also has national security and defense implications, does it not? When I look at what the U.S. imports from China, it does include minerals used in a range of defense products. You mentioned radar before. Also, almost every surface and subsurface ship, aircraft, from fighter jets to bombers. So there are a number of defense implications to this as well, aren't there?
1,000%. And the Chinese, in the summer, they moved to a presumptive denial of any end defense use. And then on October 9th, they went to an explicit denial. So it has caught us again with our proverbial pants down. And it's one of these, you look back and think, how did we build a dependency with a geopolitical rival around critical inputs for our military technology? But, this is where we are. I should just say, for the point of thinking about, deterrence and our own toolkit, it's not as if, though, we don't have choke points on the Chinese. The Chinese, I think, have shown a bit more willingness to use their choke points, and Xi Jinping is not going to be scared off by a market downturn over one Friday afternoon. But it's important remembering that the Chinese are not the only ones with leverage.
Yeah. So one of the issues that does not appear to have come up, although there was a lot of speculation that it would be the Chinese apparently trying to shift the U.S. position on Taiwan. Beijing had hoped, and there had been a range of press reports along these lines, to alter the U.S. position of not supporting Taiwan independence to opposing it. Did the issue come up? And how are U.S. officials thinking about the status of Taiwan under President Trump?
So the president said that Taiwan did not come up in the meeting. And just to give some context for what you were just discussing, it has long been a Chinese ask of the United States to come out and change declaratory policy from what sounds like this esoteric distinction between the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence, moving that or shifting that to the United States opposes independence. And we don't have time to get into the historical lineage of this, but just the short version is a language change like that could potentially give Beijing a pretty big psychological win by creating, and instilling further doubt and uncertainty in the minds of many people in Taiwan who are already, as you know, when because we had these discussions when we were there earlier in the year, there's a lot of concern and nervousness about the direction of travel of U.S. policy on Taiwan and the strength of the U.S. Commitment. And so what looked like esoteria of language actually cut to the heart of I think concern in Taiwan, and what I think is the dominant Chinese strategy, which is not just preparing for an invasion, but more so creating conditions that break the political and psychological will of the Taiwan people.
So, I mean, it is interesting you brought this up. I mean, when we were in Taiwan and met with senior officials earlier in 2025, I mean, the way I would characterize it is that as they watched the U.S. withdraw from Afghanistan and the government collapsed, and then with some U.S. officials questioning the need to support Ukraine, there were legitimate questions about if the Chinese were to conduct a blockade or an invasion of Taiwan. To what degree would U.S. Would a U.S. president, the U.S. military be willing to shed blood for Taiwan? I mean, legitimate questions within Taiwan, looking at U.S. actions overseas. Is that how you would characterize some of the concerns in Taipei right now about U.S. commitment?
Yeah, first, it's important to remember that for 75 years, certainly since the first Taiwan Straits crisis of 1954, the heart of this strategic dilemma for the United States has been how far is it willing to go to support Taiwan? The reasons have changed. There were not semiconductors in 1954. Discussions in 1954, second Taiwan Straits crisis in 1958, on and on and on, have been around the issue of the strength of an allied defense perimeter, the criticality of Taiwan to that, and how far we would go to support Taiwan, knowing that the risks to U.S. servicemen and women would be significant. So in some sense, I think it's helpful and important to remember that this is not a new issue. And also, Taiwan has been worried about U.S. credibility on and off literally every single year, especially since 1979 when we changed, when we stopped diplomatically recognizing Taiwan and shifted that to Beijing. So I think there's reason for concern in Taiwan about where U.S. policy is going. And this is not just a Trump administration thing. I think you're seeing a growing chorus of voices asking us to rethink the extent to which we would and in what conditions we would support Taiwan. But as I always, we pointed out when we were there, and I always try to point out, I think the risk of miscalculation on Beijing's part here is the more salient one, because I worry that they overinterpret a free-flowing debate about U.S. foreign policy and foreign commitments, and somehow assume that the Trump administration is wavering, where there's really no evidence for that on the issue of Taiwan.
It was interesting, Jude. I sat down with Senator Tim Sheehy and Senator Tim Kaine a couple weeks ago and asked actually Senator Sheehy first, Republican from Montana, about China and what he says to his constituents, including if the Chinese were to successfully seize Taiwan, what would the implications be? And he said, I first start off by telling my constituents that there would be an economic challenge, and it's not just the Chinese seizure of everything from semiconductors, but it's also the potential for impacting some of the trade routes that go in and around Taiwan. But how do you see it? I mean, how do you see, for an average American, how do you see the importance of Taiwan, and what would be the implications if the Chinese were to successfully, either through force or even without using force, but they were able to control Taiwan? What would the implications be?
Yeah, this is one where I think it is difficult to quickly and in a bumper sticker convey to the average American in Poughkeepsie, New York, the stakes on this, because this is a complicated thicket of interests that the United States has, ranging from economic to security. I mean, one way to do it is just start with as you were doing, start with an end state, which is if China is able to gain leverage or control over Taiwan tomorrow. I don't think Beijing gets TSMC, right? I think in any sort of military attack on Taiwan, The semiconductor ecosystem is yes, it's bricks and mortar, but it is a fragile ecosystem of human talent, of critical inputs. You need lithography machines coming from the Netherlands. Taiwan is not self-sufficient on semiconductor manufacturing. So I think Beijing, in a sense, would be risking that it would cut itself off from TSMC as well. But let's just posit that they get it. Number one is we have our own strategic challenge in our overt dependency on Taiwan for advanced semiconductors, right? 90-something% of the market of advanced semiconductors is coming from Taiwan. Now, I don't think explaining that to an American that that's a great thing, and it's something we should certainly work to diversify. That itself is a all eggs in one basket approach. But right now, it binds us to Taiwan in important ways that the U.S. economy cannot substitute around. The second, and this is admittedly where it's harder in a barroom conversation to get to the point quickly, but we really don't know what the world looks like if China successfully takes control of Taiwan in terms of regional instability. You could see a world in which there is bandwagoning around China, and that would have its own economic effects on the United States, because so much commerce and trade for the United States that is critical for us is transiting through maritime sea lanes of communication in and around Taiwan. It could also mean that we see a race for nuclear proliferation as countries like South Korea and Japan, now that they do not see the United States as reliable, race to gain the capability to stave off further Chinese encroachments. And remember that a lot of countries in the region have their own territorial disputes with China. I think it's plausible that Xi Jinping, once he has planted a flag on Taiwan, begins looking up to territories controlled by the Japanese, like the Senkaku
Islands.
Yeah, second Thomas Shoal, so that implicates the Philippines. I think that's a reasonable bet. And so I'll just end by saying this is why we don't want to get into any of this. We don't want to go to war with China, but we also want to stave off a world in which China becomes the regional hegemon, which is why credible deterrence now is the cheapest, safest way for us to keep stability in the region.
So let me ask you a question about some of the PLA exercises and activity in and around Taiwan and the South China Sea. I mean, I was out last week in Japan at Kadena Air Force Base inside the first island chain, and just talking to American, mostly Air Force, Special Operations, and others deployed to Okinawa. They outlined a pretty what I'll call aggressive and frequent display of exercises. We saw the various joint swords in 2024. We've seen more exercises in and around Taiwan this year with various PLA entities, PLA Navy, Air Force, rocket forces, and others. What do you make of all the PLA, People's Liberation Army activity in and around Taiwan? Does that suggest that they are actually quite serious about bringing Taiwan back into the Chinese fold?
Yeah, and I'll speak to it from the angle of thinking about the broader strategic piece, because I'm not an expert. You're going to know more on the PLA as a military than I will. But I'll just say, if we're thinking about where we are in 2025 from where we were on the cusp of then Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August 2022, we're just night and day difference in terms of the size, scale, intensity, and regularity of PLA presence in and around the Taiwan Strait on all sides of the island. We're definitely moving from a paradigm where we saw sort of episodic shows of force in response to actions taken on Taiwan or in the United States, to now basically sustained military presence and what clearly looked like rehearsal for campaign level operations surrounding Taiwan. I don't think there should be a debate about whether the Chinese are serious about this. I think there is a debate, and I firmly come down on the side that we still have options and time, and that Xi Jinping has not circled the date on a calendar in 2027 and decided. But to some point, that all blurs together, because if you see a rival of significant industrial political magnitude throwing a lot of resources, and as we're seeing with the PLA now, it's robotic systems, amphibious landing drills, it's lawfare and gray zone. It's using the Coast Guard. I mean, it is the entire toolkit now that you saw it episodically and in pieces. That is all coming together, sometimes in an individual exercise. Yes, I think some of this is deterrence, right? I think Beijing is trying to psychologically send a signal to Taiwan, but most importantly, the United States, that we, the Chinese, will risk everything for this island. I think they would risk a lot, but I think there is a bit of psychological messaging here, that there might be a slight delta between bark and bite. Do I think Xi Jinping really wants to get into a military conflict with the United States over Taiwan? No,
not right now.
I think that would be arguably that would be the riskiest gambit of a career of a man who has been a very calculated risk taker. This is not a reckless individual, right? This is not Putin. There has been no, invasion of Ukraine from Xi Jinping. He is a careful, calculated, methodical risk taker. But I think we are hurtling towards an environment where the Chinese are showing ever greater levels of competency, capability, and to something that I know we've talked about. Yes, the PLA has significant pathologies, and they're on display. They were on display at the fourth plenum, where we're continuing to see a pretty significant purge of senior levels of the PLA in the Central Military Commission
for corruption, among other things.
Yeah, for in quotes corruption. But I do think this is an absolutely lethal trajectory we're on, where the United States, I think, especially in concert with allies and partners, has a lot on the table, but the Chinese are leaving nothing to chance.
So you mentioned Vladimir Putin. This will be the last question, Jude, because we are just about out of time. There had been some suggestions that President Trump might try to get some leverage from Xi Jinping and the Chinese to try to end the war and put some pressure on Vladimir Putin and the Russians. President Trump has repeatedly, in some cases, threatened to impose tariffs on additional countries like China that purchase Russian oil. It does not look like that issue came up, or if it did, nobody's talking about it. But I guess the big question for you is, do you have any sense that the U.S. can break sort of a Nixon in China, any kind of break that relationship between Moscow and Beijing, or is that a fool's errand?
Yeah, I think many of us who've been watching what the Chinese have been saying and doing since February 2022 feel like a broken record here, because my answer to that question, 4 years ago or 5 years ago or 8 years ago is the same as it is today, which is, we need to forget the lessons of the Sino-Soviet split and the normalization of relations between the U.S. and China, because we were able to drive a wedge then because Moscow and Beijing had already driven the wedge. I mean, they were in military conflict. There was an ideological contest for control of the international communist movement. Those conditions do not exist today. Now, the relationship between Russia and China is not perfect. There are clear cleavages in domains like energy, economics, technology, even geopolitical. But this is a relationship that has more going for it than it does against it. And also, imagine you're Putin or Xi Jinping, what is the riskier bet? Breaking a strategic alliance which allows these two countries, which share a 4,000-kilometer border, to basically not have to think about tensions between each other. And for Russia, they can focus out to the west, and China, it can focus out to the east. What could be riskier than driving a wedge or poisoning that chalice for the United States? Especially, I think it's charitable to say the Trump administration does not have the greatest track record on consistency and can turn on a dime. So I think both for tactical and strategic reasons, we mentally need to shift from driving wedges and now think about how are we going to live in a geopolitical environment where we have a convergence of autocratic force like we're seeing now.
Yeah, well, we will unfortunately have to leave it at that. Great answer, though. I think the reality is, anyway, we've seen so many meetings between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin right now. Hard to see any country, let alone the United States, break that relationship. Really appreciate you, Jude, taking the time to talk with us today, and thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Seth. Great to chat.
Thanks for listening to our episode today. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For more analysis, please visit csis.org. This is the last line of defense.